Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about ecosystems and energy. This video is targeted for AP biology students, but anyone is welcome to watch and learn. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about ecology, we can break ecology down into a couple different categories. We have population ecology that studies the interactions between individuals of the same population. Then you have community ecology that takes into account and studies the interactions between populations. And now we're looking at ecosystem ecology, where now we're adding in the abiotic components of life, those non-living factors such as nutrients, sunlight, matter, energy, etc., like water availability, everything. So ecosystem ecology is looking at the entire ecosystem and not just like the interactions between living members of a community. And then you could study, like when we go even bigger than ecosystems, when you talk about biomes reference like similar ecosystems. So if I said the desert biome, that would mean like in your mind, you're picturing dry, very little rainfall, low plant matter. Like in a desert, no matter where you are on Earth, they have similar characteristics in a desert ecosystem. So that makes up like a desert biome. Okay, so here though, we are focusing on ecosystem ecology. And basically, we're taking what we've learned in population ecology, community ecology, and now we're adding in two new things: energy flow and chemical cycling. So we're really focusing on available energy in an ecosystem and how that affects community dynamics as well as population dynamics. And we'll be looking at chemical cycling, the availability of nutrients as limiting factors, as well as the carbon, water, and nitrogen cycles, and how having those major elements matter to life. Think about it, CHONP. This ties into our unit 1 from the very beginning, what life depends on. Okay, so when we look at this picture here, you see a couple different arrows. So here we have red arrows, white arrows. There's no white, sorry, I meant yellow and blue. And so what we are going to focus on mostly is looking at the movement of energy through a food web or a food chain. And along with that energy, the matter, like comparing and contrasting the two. So when you look at like the sun shining down, the sun shines down onto plants, and then plants are able to take in carbon dioxide, right? So plants will take in carbon dioxide and then build macromolecules and build life from carbon dioxide and water. So we have this glucose. And then our mitochondria as a heterotroph will break down and release that energy stored in the food. But in that process, some of that energy is given off as heat. So when we look at, just real quick, this transfer of energy through just the first couple trophic levels. So we start with solar energy. Now, the sun and solar energy is the ultimate source of energy on Earth. But the problem is that solar energy is not usable energy. You can't just go out in the sun and then feel like full or ready to run a marathon or something. So plants or other photosynthetic organisms, our autotrophs, are really what are responsible for converting that solar energy into chemical or usable energy by life. So it's through the process of photosynthesis that that solar energy is converted into chemical energy stored in the bonds of our macromolecules, our organic molecules, our carbs, lipids, and proteins, and nucleic acids. So when we eat our food, though, if I eat the peach on a tree, for example, that stored potential energy in the bonds will now be taken into me, but then as my mitochondria breaks down and releases the energy from those bonds, quite a bit actually of that potential energy is released as heat. Now, heat is not a usable form of energy, and therefore, as we go through like trophic levels. So now, as I went from the primary producers of the plants to the herbivores, the primary consumers, now as I'm moving on to the secondary consumers, we want to think about how much potential energy is remaining. So as that squirrel ate its food, a lot of the energy was used, right? So like some of it came off, a lot of it came off as heat, because the enzymes are not 100% efficient at converting energy. And that's like the laws of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics of increasing disorder and entropy. So here we lose some of that energy in the conversion process as heat. And then you want to think about, well, the animal, the squirrel's going to use some of that energy to find food, to find a mate, to feed offspring, to live life. But some of the food that the animal takes in, the squirrel takes in, will actually be stored as biomass. Some of its food will actually be used to build new cells or to store fat on the body. So when we think about, on average, only about 10% of the food that organism ate, the squirrel ate, actually is staying within its tissues and is now available as energy for that raccoon for the next trophic level. So as we go through trophic levels in an ecosystem, like in a food chain or a food web, in each step, a lot of the energy is used up and comes off as heat. So if we only have the plants as our first source of creating usable energy by photosynthesis, as you go up a food chain or food web, the amount of available energy decreases. Now, this is one of the reasons why top predators require so much land, per capita. I forget, when I was in Costa Rica a decade ago, I thought a ranger told me that one jaguar requires 100,000 acres of rainforest. Now, don't quote me, but that's what I remember. And so, it takes that much rainforest biomass in order, as to go up the trophic levels, to have enough energy to support that one large predator. Now, if I could recommend a movie to you, I would recommend Disney Nature Bears. In Bears, it's a fantastic documentary type movie that really shows the struggle of a large predator finding enough calories and enough food. And yeah, it's one of my favorite nature movies to really show that the beauty in life as well as the struggle being a top predator. We think about bears as being able just to find food, but it gets more difficult as you go up the food chains or food webs. Now, this is different though than matter, which is our carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, sulfur, potassium, all of the elements that make us. Matter is not created or destroyed. It just cycles. Now, I think this is beautiful. When we really think about what is happening here, here we have a carbon in the form of a gas in our atmosphere, in our air. So it's an abiotic molecule at this point, right? And then through photosynthesis, it's taken in the Calvin cycle, it's going to be converted into a G3P. And that G3P will be used to build lipids, carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and it's actually incorporated into life, into an organic molecule. It is now biotic. And so now it might be in a molecule of glucose. And so as that squirrel eats the peach and takes in that sugar, that carbon could come off during respiration. Now it's back into the abiotic atmosphere. Or maybe it got stored as fat, and now it's part of a fatty acid chain in the adipose tissue of the squirrel. So now when the raccoon eats the squirrel, that carbon is now in the raccoon. And maybe the raccoon breaks down that fat as energy, and maybe that carbon's back into the atmosphere. Or maybe it came out in its poop, right? And now a dung beetle is going to eat that carbon. And now that's taken in and the carbon's in the dung beetle's body. Or maybe that carbon was rearranged and used to build amino acids, and now it's in the muscle tissue of the raccoon. So when the coyote eats that raccoon, now the carbon is in the coyote. So when we look at carbon, though, and matter and mass as it moves through a food chain or a food web, it's not destroyed. It doesn't decrease. Rather, it just becomes transformed from one form to another. It cycles between biotic and abiotic. When you think about like all of the water on earth, the water that you drink, like I have a glass of water right here, like as you drink this water, and then maybe it's going to evaporate from me later when I go for a run, or maybe I'm going to breathe it back out, or maybe I'll pee it out, or maybe it'll stay part of my tissues, but somehow it's going to enter back into the atmosphere where now it's water vapor, and then it'll join and become part of the water cycle where it'll rain down. Maybe it'll end up in an aquifer as it like filters through the earth, and then 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, a human pumps that water up and drinks it. Maybe it ends up in a river and into the ocean. Who knows? But the molecules themselves are just cycled. So here, the water that's in my glass very easily could have passed through a dinosaur 65, 70 million years ago and came out as dinosaur pee. And then through the water cycle, it got filtered, and now I'm drinking it today, right? So when we think about matter is not created or destroyed. It just is cycled, and it's actually really quite beautiful, along with the energy moving through an ecosystem. They're both beautiful concepts. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more specific, though, about like the science-y part of all of this. So here, when we talk about primary production, right? If we are talking about like measuring energy in an ecosystem, so we look, if we can remember from community ecology, we have different trophic levels, right? So our first bottom trophic level in an ecosystem are your photosynthetic autotrophs. So they are our primary producers that are converting that solar energy into stored chemical energy. So this process is called primary production, and you can actually measure like how much potential energy is in an area, right? So the amount of light energy converted into chemical energy is called primary production, and we store that energy in the bonds of our organic molecules. So when we compare different ecosystems, you have the rainforest with high primary productivity. And if you think about like, well, why does the rainforest have high primary productivity compared to the desert? They both appear to have lots of sunshine, right? So then you need to think to yourself, well, when it comes down to photosynthesis, photosynthesis requires sunlight, but it also requires water and carbon dioxide. But if carbon dioxide's in the air, well, then water becomes the limiting factor. And if you look at the rainforest, it's in the name, rainforest. It's going to have water constantly falling. And so therefore, primary productivity, photosynthesis, can just go, It has like sunlight. If the rainforest is near the equator, sunlight year-round, nice warm temperatures for the enzymes, tons of water. You're going to have high primary production. Whereas in the desert here, you're going to have a little bit lower primary production. This looks to be Joshua Tree in Southern California, very hot and dry and little rainfall. Well, really cold in winter, actually. And so when we talk about primary production, we can talk about it in two ways. You have your gross primary productivity versus your net primary productivity. So your GPP, or your gross primary productivity, is the total amount of energy from sunlight converted into chemical energy. But then the plants aren't doing that just for us, right? The plants are going to do photosynthesis for themselves as well. So they're going to use some of that energy. They have their own mitochondria, even though students tend to forget that, or people, not just students, but like we think about plants having chloroplasts and animals having mitochondria. We need to remember that plants also have mitochondria. So they are going to take some of that glucose or organic molecules that they made, and they're going to break it down to release ATP. So whatever is left over after the plants use some of this chemical energy for their own growth, metabolism, reproduction, repair, etc., the remaining potential energy stored in that plant is called the net primary productivity. And that is what is like available for the next trophic level, for the herbivores to come and eat those plants. Like that's the energy that can be passed on to the herbivore trophic level. Okay, so here's just a picture from Google Images. You can hit pause and you can kind of read it if you'd like. So when we look at different ecosystems around the world, their amounts of primary productivity are not all equal, right? So when we look at where is there a ton of primary productivity, you're going to find swamps and marshes, living in like warm, humid, lots of water, lots of sunshine. Swamps and marshes will have high primary productivity, the rainforest. Now, when you see a temperate forest, think about like North America, like the United States has like a temperate forest. If you picture areas like Virginia or like the Appalachian Trail, you kind of call those like a temperate forest. Up in like Washington, the state of Washington is a temperate rainforest, actually. So temperate is like moderate temperatures. And then you have, as you keep going north here, the northern coniferous forest is like, I'm sorry, like pine trees, taiga, but it's like really cold there. So even if they do have lots of like open land and space, the sunshine isn't quite they have like shorter days being at a northern latitudes, as well as the colder temperatures could also slow down the enzyme productivity during photosynthesis. And then as you move down, you see like savanna, agricultural land, woodland, shrubland, etc. So when you think about this you're going to have different limiting factors. Is it the amount of water, the amount of sunlight that affects how much plants are actually growing? So like in a grassland, it may be the amount of water that falls, or in a savanna, the amount of water. And then our aquatic ecosystems, an estuary is where you have like a river meeting the ocean. And so estuaries have high primary productivity along our coastlines. And then we have lakes and streams, the continental shelf, and the open ocean having the least. Actually, if you go even further, okay. So let's go ahead and talk about autotrophs in a little bit. Actually, I think I'm going to go ahead and I would like to hit pause and add a picture real fast about this idea. Okay, so sorry, as I was teaching, I realized that this picture wasn't in my PowerPoint, and it's, I think, a beautiful picture. So if we look at how ecosystems or biomes are distributed across planet Earth, right? So we have certain factors that are going to determine where you find them. So you have at the bottom, as you go, like you have the hot temperatures, and then you can have like, so here you have hot heat, but then the limiting factor here is the amount of rain. So as you go from like a really wet environment with the tropical rainforest over to the dry, you get actually like the dry tropical forest can actually like get converted into a savanna, which would be a tropical desert, and then a dry tropical desert. And kind of like, I don't know for the word like scarily, unfortunately, like a scary thing that has happened is that with the Amazon rainforest has actually, with all of like the logging and the burning and the deforestation combined with climate change, the sections of the Amazon rainforest have actually undergone periods of drought. And one of the predictions, if climate change continues, is that the Amazon rainforest, as we continue to change our planet, climate change is going to change where water falls and where like certain temperatures. So as you change the water cycle, you change the biomes. And so that is one of the fears, or at least for me, of like, how is Earth going to change as we go through climate change? It's predicted that the Amazon rainforest 100 years from now could be a savanna. It'll still be in that hot central region of our world, but the rainfall won't be there, and therefore it'll be converted into a savanna, and then we lose all of that biodiversity, as well as all of those trees that act as carbon sinks, which store carbon. And yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how life plays out. Now you could also see as you go up with the decreasing temperatures, so a little bit cooler temperatures, you have that temperate deciduous rainforest, which is still very wet, very humid. So that's again like over in Virginia and stuff. If you saw the Hunger Games, the Hunger Games were filmed in like a temperate deciduous forest. Then you have our grassland. So this is like the middle of the United States. And so a little bit drier, a little cooler. And then you have chaparral. So a lot of California is actually like a chaparral ecosystem. Not too incredibly hot, but dry. And then you get to the desert. So one thing that you might hear about in life is this process called desertification. And in desertification, it's where like a grassland or a chaparral ecosystem slowly get converted into a desert, and that makes it very difficult for like growing food and crops and stuff. Now, as you get colder and you increase in latitude, you get more into those like pine tree, the coniferous forests, the taiga, the boreal. This is like in southern Canada, I guess you could say. So the boreal, like northern United States. You have the boreal forest, so beautiful. And then we get even higher up into like near the Arctic Circle and stuff, and you have the tundra. And the tundra is actually like a polar desert. So anyway, this I think is a beautiful diagram that kind of shows how temperature and rainfall can have an influence on the plant life, and then that has an influence on the animal and biodiversity that you find in ecosystems. Okay. So let's go ahead and talk more about autotrophs. So we actually have two kinds of autotrophs. You have the kind that do photosynthesis, but then there's also autotrophs, I don't know if it's in my next slide or not, that are found at the bottom of our oceans near hydrothermal vents. And they actually are, there's no sunlight miles and miles below the ocean surface. And so therefore they're going to use chemicals in their environment as the driving like source of like basically the Calvin cycle. So when we use like ATP and NADP, plants use ATP and NADPH in order to like build during the Calvin cycle. Instead, and the hydrothermal vents, they'll be using chemicals like sulfur-based chemicals to break down and use the electrons from there in order to build in the Calvin cycle. Okay, so you have your photosynthetic food chain as well as your chemosynthetic food chain, where they use like sulfur-based molecules in order to build life. So I just thought I would mention that just in case you ever come across that. So when we talk about energy transfer, though, between our trophic levels, we move from our primary producers to our primary consumers to our secondary consumers to our tertiary consumers, and maybe even a fifth trophic level called the quaternary structure. We lose energy at each step in a food chain or food web. And so we have these things called pyramids. So this is actually showing us an energy pyramid that shows only about 10% of the energy in one trophic level is available for the next trophic level. And the reasoning for that is because like that mouse, or let's say the mouse is fine. So as the mouse eats the grasshopper, the mouse is going to use up some of its energy, like a lot of the energy in that food for life, for its metabolism. Like think about a mouse has a super high metabolic rate, as it's an endotherm, has to generate heat. So the mouse is active, finding food, finding mates, escaping predators. Very little of its food will actually become part of its body. And so therefore only about 10% of that potential energy that it ate is now stored in its tissues, available for the snake. So there is a limit with how high we can go, how many trophic levels can exist. So this is something fun that I usually do in my class. So if you're watching at home and you have some popcorn handy, try it out. So if you start with 20 pieces of popcorn, mimicking like the primary producers in an ecosystem, and then you have only 10% available for the next trophic level, well, now we would have 2, right? And then if we only have 10% of those 2, I usually have my students like try and break off a 10th of each of these. So then you have a small piece. You try and break a 10th of that. And you can see this is the reason why, if only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level is available to the next, why very rarely do you have more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. And this is due to the second law of thermodynamics, because of that increasing entropy over time, where we lose a lot of that potential energy as heat in our activities. And so especially being endotherms, like as a mammal, we use a lot of our food energy to create that heat to maintain our homeostasis. So when we think about, I kind of want to tie this in real fast to populations and community ecology. So when we think about ecosystems and ecosystem stability, it really comes, one of the things that comes down to is how much energy is available in an ecosystem. So if an ecosystem is experiencing a drought, right? So let's say rain is just not falling. Well, then the plants aren't going to be as efficient in photosynthesis, which means there's less available energy for the trophic levels, which means more intense competition and a greater struggle for existence and less surviving. And then you tie in like the population dynamics as they reach carrying capacity or as they like struggle for resources. Then you have competition for similar resources between different populations and different species. And when we think about like the whole ecosystem dynamics, it really comes down to that amount of potential energy. So when we have forest fires, when you have floods, when you have hurricanes, when you have natural disasters that wipe out the plant life in an area, it's devastating for that ecosystem. And that is where like secondary succession can come into play, and it takes some time to regrow that life. But on the other side, sometimes we have lots of rain. Like in California here, we go through what's called an El Nino every 7 or so years, where we'll have like lots of rain, and with that rain comes lots of plant growth. And then with lots of plant growth, there's lots of herbivores, and it's like a win-win situation. So I just wanted to point out that the amount of energy from that producer level has impacts that ripple through all trophic levels and the entire ecosystem. And when we talked about that pyramid of energy a few slides ago, it's not just a pyramid of energy that you see over on the right, but you have the pyramids of biomass and pyramids of numbers as well. So when you look at like a pyramid of biomass, that is actually like how much mass or matter is actually there. So an easy way is if you like have fresh basil versus dried basil. That fresh basil has lots of water in it. So if you were to dehydrate the basil and have the water evaporate, the actual like dried basil that you have in a spice jar is like the biomass. So your biomass is like the matter that makes a living thing. So just because, my point is, if you look at the pyramid of biomass in the ocean, and you see that the phytoplankton numbers are less than the zooplankton's trophic level. Well, in the pyramid of energy, like that's all that matters, is that there has to be more energy on the trophic level before to support the trophic level above. But in the biomass example, and then pyramid of numbers, like the actual count, it turns out that phytoplankton are so short-lived that they get eaten pretty fast by phytoplankton or they die. There's a high fast turnover, and zooplankton live longer. So when you look at direct numbers, sure, there's more zooplankton, but the actual energy that the phytoplankton provide is greater. So this is where you may not see exact matches between pyramid of numbers, pyramid of biomass, or pyramid of energy. Okay. So now humans and our role in the food chain and food web, right? So as I've grown up and I've learned a lot through teaching both AP Environmental Science as well as AP Bio, I've come to learn that our food choices have huge impacts on Earth's resources, right? So if you think about humanity, we are over 7 billion people on Earth, and the food choices we make have a big impact on our ecosystems. So it's kind of interesting to compare, the food requirements, how much land, what is it's called our footprint on Earth, as a person, how many resources do I require to support me? So when I read a study once that showed the amount of land that it took to make a serving of beef. I don't know the size of the hamburger, if it was a steak. It was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But the one meal of meat, all of the corn that it took it was a corn-fed cow, not a grass-fed cow. But all of the land that it took to raise that corn to feed the cow, to have the cow eat enough calories as well as grow up enough to get to an age where it could be slaughtered to eat the meat, and all of the water that went into raising those crops, etc., for one meal. It took 16 acres, and on that, if you planted like potatoes on that land, you could actually feed like 22 people or something like that. And so it just was something like made me really think about, like as a vegetarian or a meat eater, like how many resources are being used. So when you think about like how much food it actually takes to raise our animals that we eat. So in America, we eat about 10 billion animals per year, and we're only 330 million people. So all of the grain, all of the food that we need to grow to feed those chickens and pigs and cows, we have to grow it somewhere, right? So it takes a lot of water, takes a lot of fertilizer, takes a lot of land to feed 10 billion animals. And so when you think about how much it goes into raising a cow to get just 1/4 pound hamburger, you're looking at almost 7 pounds of grain and 50 gallons of water and 75 square feet of grazing or growing crops. So for me, I think about that 6.7 pounds of grain for one hamburger. And I always think about the grocery store when I'm buying rice. Like, I love rice. So if I buy like a 5-pound bag of rice, I think about like how many meals I can get from that. And yes, I know rice is a starch and it doesn't have all the amino acids that a hamburger does, but at the same time, it is still calories. So if I think about like 5 pounds of rice and how many people that can feed versus this 1/4 pound hamburger, it makes you kind of step back and realize how many of Earth's resources are going into raising cows. So the higher you eat on a food chain or a food web, meaning the more meat and dairy you have in your diet, the greater the impact you as a person are having on the planet that is requiring a lot of Earth's resources. And if we think about like, where does this land come from? When we think about our major forest, like rainforests that are home to biodiversity on our planet, we think of like there's 3 major reasons why our rainforests are undergoing deforestation. So I'll talk about that when we get to the carbon cycle. Let's do that. Okay, so when we look at 1 pound of beef, the amount of water that cow requires to get just 1 pound of beef is equal to the amount of water you use in 6 months of showers. So for me, living in California where we go through droughts, it really makes me like water conscious of how we're using our resources. So yeah, just something to think about as you make your choices. Okay. So now, what about nutrients though? So we talked about energy and sunlight and trophic levels. Now let's move into nutrients in a food chain or a food web. So we're going to look at the ocean. When we look at the ocean has water. It has dissolved carbon dioxide. That's why it's leading to ocean acidification. And then we also have sunlight. It's the open ocean. So we have to think, well, what is the limiting factor there? How come there's not unlimited photosynthesis in the open ocean? And it really comes down to nutrient availability. So if we think about like what limits primary productivity in the ocean, it's going to be like light as you go down, but really it's going to be nutrients are more of a limiting factor than the water, the carbon dioxide, or the sunlight. So when we think about like which 5 elements are necessary for life on Earth, that's where we get our CHO from carbon dioxide and water, as well as our nitrogen and our phosphorus. So our plants and our crops will take nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil, but in the ocean, there is no soil, right? So nitrogen and phosphorus are actually the limiting factors in the ocean that makes primary productivity possible. So I'm just going to share one example of how humans are having an impact on this. So here's some farmland, and when we look at our farms, we have rivers running through, like I'm based in the United States. So in the United States, we have the major Mississippi River and like a lot of rivers that will lead and dump into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi will enter into the Gulf. So like here on the right is like the river. So you can see how farmland covers a lot of the U.S. We're going to talk about this ecological issue called eutrophication that deals with nutrients. So as we have farmed our grasslands, we removed the native prairie grasses with like 4-foot long roots, and we replaced them with crops that we like grow, we harvest, we plant again and again and again. And those nutrients, which are limiting factors to plant growth for the amino acids and the nucleic acids essential for life, that nitrogen and phosphorus gets taken out of the soil. So therefore, fertilizer needs to add, like we use fertilizer to add that nitrogen and phosphorus back. So we use synthetic man-made fertilizer that is going to help the plants grow, but at the same time, when it rains, the rain is going to wash this nitrogen and phosphorus into our waterways. And as the nitrogen and phosphorus enter into our water, it flows into the Mississippi, all collecting across the breadbasket of America, and enters into the Gulf of Mexico. So you may be thinking, cool, yo, here we have the limiting factors, the nitrogen and the phosphorus that the photosynthetic organisms need. So the problem becomes, though, that it's excess nutrients. And so now what we have, oops, that was on a timer, is that the little tiny like photosynthetic organisms, the algae in the oceans, and the phytoplankton are going to do photosynthesis, and their population is going to thrive. They're going to have exponential growth. Then, however, once they use up that nitrogen and that phosphorus, or maybe there's still plentiful nitrogen and phosphorus, but they're short-lived and they start to die. So this here is what we call an algal bloom. They use up the nitrogen and phosphorus and they have exponential growth. And then we have these aerobic decomposers. They're going to clean up the algal blooms. So as these photosynthetic organisms die, then the aerobic decomposers decompose and break them down and recycle the parts. However, now we have an increase in the decomposer population. But the issue here is the main problem with this, is that these are aerobic decomposers. So they consume and use up the oxygen. They deplete the water of oxygen, dissolved oxygen, which now creates a hypoxic zone, which leads to the death of fish and life. So the decomposers consume oxygen, creating a hypoxic zone, and life dies. This is called a dead zone. So here, this process is called cultural eutrophication. From our lifestyles, we add these excess fertilizers, this excess runoff, leading to algal blooms and hypoxic environments. So when you think about, like, if this is called the watershed of the United States, it's massive, collecting rain runoff and then going into those rivers, and they all drop down into the Gulf of Mexico. And so here are pictures of algal blooms that lead to death and massive die-offs of life in the ocean. So it's pretty sad, but I've never been to Louisiana or like Mississippi, or at least not yet. I have plans to go. And if you think about like fishermen and the economy off of that coast, it tanked. Like here's people, like their jobs are to fish, and then people eat the fish. But when you have hypoxic environments, there is no fish. So therefore economies collapse and people don't have food. Not just the marine ecosystem, right? Like humanity also depends on the oceans. So when we think about the Gulf of Mexico and the dead zone does change from year to year. It really comes down to like what is the amount of rainfall, like how much rain did we have that year? The more rain, the more runoff, and therefore the larger the dead zone. So if we look here, 2017, the dead zone was 5,000 square miles, about the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island. Then if you look at 2018's dead zone, it was 5,700 square miles. And then we get to 2019's dead zone was almost 7,000 square miles. And when we think about this, that's the amount of the Gulf of Mexico that doesn't have fish. And everywhere on Earth you have major rivers entering into oceans, you find dead zones. It's not just a United States issue. Okay. So if I can encourage you, like, how can we help this, right? So it comes down to our cultural choices and what we do. And so I would encourage you to buy organic and avoid synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizers. If you can't grow your own food, right, then organic's going to be a better option. Try and avoid as much synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizers as possible. Now, the other thing, I know I mentioned nitrogen and phosphorus, but in case you ever get like really detailed questions on this, nitrogen is actually the limiting factor in the ocean, where phosphorus is the main limiting factor nutrient in freshwater. So here, these algal blooms are really due to an excess in nitrogen, where if you had an algal bloom in like a lake, that would be due to the excess, like the phosphorus will be what's feeding that. Now, the way you can remember this is that the ocean ends in N, nitrogen, and then fresh water is phosphorus. I don't know if that really helps, but that's how I remember it. Okay. So now let's go ahead and talk. Oh, we're almost done, guys. So as we go through, I mentioned earlier about the water cycle. So the water cycle is how water on Earth cycles, which I know it sounds kind of like, well, duh, Missy Mar, but in reality, there's some things that humanity is doing to alter our water cycle. One of them is as we have global warming, our whole Earth is getting warmer. And as the Earth gets warmer, both the water, the land, and the air, we're changing evaporation. Right? So you have like evaporation is changing, but at the same time, condensation, like warmer air holds more moisture. And therefore, if you see off the coast of Florida, when we have hurricane season, the hurricanes are larger and more massive than they used to be because those surface temperatures of the ocean as well as the air above the ocean in that Atlantic is warmer than it used to be, holding more water. So then now when it like condenses down in a hurricane, it's more disastrous than it used to be. We also have, if you look at step 9 over here with runoff, when you think about like the Himalayan mountain range, for example, the Himalayan mountain range, as those ice glaciers, like you have wintertime where snow forms and snowpack, and then in spring and summer it slowly melts. Well, that snow runoff is part of the water for people living at the base of the Himalayas. They're drinking water, they're water for life. But now with climate change and air pollution, you have a lot of air pollution landing on those glaciers, darkening them, causing these glaciers to melt faster, which now is leading to flooding. So when you think about the water cycle is not just, oh, it evaporates, condenses, rains down. Like we are changing the water cycle. If you think about the rainforest, earlier I mentioned about how the rainforest has so much water. Well, as it turns out, when it rains in the rainforest, about 50% of that rain actually came from the trees themselves. When water evaporates from trees, it is called like transpiration, and then it now has like water vapor, and then it rains. If you cut down the trees, you're losing a source of your rain. Now, some communities in villages in Africa learned this the hard way in the 60s and 70s. So if you're my student, when we watched Be the Hummingbird, Wangari Maathai, she started the Greenbelt movement in the 70s in Africa because she noticed that as populations grew, they cleared forests to plant crops. But then after like 20, 30 years, there wasn't rain. It was drying up. And so she realized, wow, when I was a child, there were a lot of trees. And now we've removed the trees and the crops are failing. Like there's no water falling. So she started the Greenbelt movement and empowered millions of women to plant trees across Africa, bringing back the rain. And so when we talk about the Amazon rainforest, and as we continue to burn the Amazon rainforest, we're losing those trees, drying out that ecosystem, converting it into a tropical savanna. Okay. So there's the water cycle. Then we have, so when you cut down trees though, like you do change the water cycle, it dries out areas. And if you don't have rain, then you don't have primary productivity. If you don't have primary productivity, then you don't have food, and that leads to starvation and it leads to death. So our forests are critically important to maintaining the health of the water cycle and life on Earth. Now, you can see this on the island that is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Over the last 100 years, Haiti removed about, I want to say 98% of its forests. And from aerial views flying over, you can see the difference in the amount of trees. And it actually is, I was watching some documentary years ago, and it was saying that Haiti might be the first country to not make it through this century simply because of lack of food and resources from losing their trees. So there's an aerial view of that. Now we talk about the carbon cycle. So in the carbon cycle on Earth, naturally, you would have like a beautiful balance. Let's see if my next, oh, that's not it. A beautiful balance between photosynthesis and respiration, right? So like as a heterotroph, breaking down carbohydrates and lipids and proteins, I am exhaling carbon dioxide. And as I exhale carbon dioxide through respiration, plants are going to take it in. So like when you hear studies of like, oh, people talking to like their plants. So if I was here to like talk to my plant, it would actually grow better because it's going to take in the carbon dioxide and do photosynthesis and then build its own mass. So when we look at the carbon cycle usually exists in this beautiful balance between plants and animals. Now, other natural sources of carbon, though, include like volcanoes can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, or decomposition can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But really, like so fires, when we think about like what a fire is, a fire are plants burning, and the plants took carbon dioxide out of the air to build their own biomass and build themselves. So a forest is kind of like a carbon sink, and it stores lots of carbon. So when you burn the forest, or when the forest catches on fire, you're releasing a lot of that carbon back into the atmosphere. And so the only thing that really takes carbon dioxide out of the air is photosynthesis. Some of the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere may dissolve into the ocean, but as we've increased carbon dioxide over the last 150 years or so, we actually have seen an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide dissolving into our oceans, and our oceans are now 30% more acidic than they used to be, simply because of carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. And so so the only way to take carbon dioxide out of the air is photosynthesis. So plant some trees, yo. All right, so when we think about our carbon cycle, though, and how humans are altering it, one of the major ways is deforestation. So there's like 3 leading ways that we are adding carbon to our atmosphere. One is burning of fossil fuels. Ooh, fossil fuels are actually really beautiful when you think about what they are. How I mentioned that those phytoplankton don't live for very long. As they like fall to the ocean floor, they become compacted, and that's where you find like when we drill for oil in the ocean, like that's ancient photosynthetic organisms. So when you burn oil, like in your car or in jets or wherever, those are like that is like the bodies of ancient life. And so you are breaking the bonds of carbohydrate chains just like you do when we eat food today. So fossil fuels, if you're burning coal is like from like 400 million years ago when ferns covered the earth. It was called the Carboniferous period, and you had lots of ferns getting buried and compacted. Like the Appalachian Mountain Range in the United States has lots of coal. And so that coal came from those ferns being buried. So when you burn coal, you're just burning like really compact plant matter. So therefore, burning fossil fuels is just taking like ancient photosynthetic organisms that had taken the carbon dioxide out of the air and stored it, and now you're putting it back. So burning of fossil fuels adds carbon dioxide back to the environment. And then you have deforestation. So when I first started learning about this stuff a decade or more ago, I thought, well, deforestation, aren't they just going to use the trees and like build furniture or houses or something? What I didn't realize with deforestation is that they're actually like, I thought it was for logging. It's actually they're burning it, right? So like we burn our forests because it's faster to clear it. So when we really think about like what are the major reasons that we have deforestation, because the three leading causes of an increase in greenhouse gases is fossil fuels and deforestation are our top two. And those alternate. Some years, deforestation has a greater impact on carbon dioxide than fossil fuels do. And then the third is our agricultural practices and modern agriculture, which again comes to our food choices, So buy local, buy organic. Okay, so when we look at three major reasons why we have deforestation. So our first, in the Amazon, it's to we burn the forest down, and the forest fires are constant. I've heard different statistics over the years, and one of them is that we're burning about 40 football fields per minute. I don't know. You can fact check that. You get all different kinds of ranges. I think it's hard to really estimate, but the fact is you can see it from outer space. The fires. And so as we constantly burn the Amazon rainforest, not only are we losing that biodiversity, but all of that stored carbon, if those trees are hundreds of years old, you are releasing so much carbon back into the atmosphere, increasing those greenhouse gases. But why are we burning the rainforest, right? Well, the Amazon, it's to plant crops. We're going to plant soy crops and corn crops. And if you think about, well, why are we planting crops in the Amazon? Why get rid of all that biodiversity? Well, those crops are used to feed those 10 billion animals we eat when you eat hamburgers or tacos or ribs or something. So every time that you eat an animal that was not raised organically, you are contributing to the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest as well as climate change, because it's that corn and that soy that is shipped back to our feedlots here where we feed our animals that corn instead of grass. And that's where we grow it. So if you are going to eat meat, I would encourage you to try and buy grass-fed, American-raised grass-fed cows. It'll be a little bit more money, but your ecological impact will be less. Okay, still high because it's a cow, but less. And then you have, and it's going to be healthier meat too, the grass-fed versus corn-fed. And then other reasons why we have deforestation, you could have, like in some parts of Africa, it's not just for like growing major crops for profit or something, but rather like just surviving and living. As the human population grows, we're over 7 billion people. So we burn some forests, plant some crops. It's like for normal like sustenance living. And then the third reason that a major area of rainforest is the palm oil plantations in Indonesia. So a lot of Indonesia's rainforest is being burned to make way to plant palm oil crops. Okay, so if you're concerned, look more into palm oil. It is important. And then we have our nitrogen cycle. And in our nitrogen cycle, we need nitrogen for our proteins and our DNA, our nucleic acids. And so nitrogen is essential. However, most nitrogen on Earth, I don't know if that's true, a lot of nitrogen is found in our atmosphere. So our atmosphere is about 78, 79% nitrogen, but it's N2, but it has a triple covalent bond. So that nitrogen is actually not usable by just breathing in. Like I can't just breathe in nitrogen and then build amino acids from it. So therefore, we actually are going to rely on bacteria as a critical part of our nitrogen cycle. So we have nitrogen fixing bacteria that will take soil nitrogen and convert it into a way that when the plants take up that nitrogen, they can now build amino acids. It's a symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the plants. The bacteria live on the roots, and then the roots get the nitrogen. So when we look at like the basics of this, so here you have a plant, there's bacteria living on the roots, and when they take in nitrogen, they convert it into a form that the plant can use to make amino acids, and then that nitrogen is passed to us herbivores, or if you're like, I don't eat plants, Miss Dumar, cool, when you eat that cow, now you have that nitrogen. And so the bacteria do something called nitrogen fixation, where they are, they live in like nodules on the roots of plants. I want to go back to like this picture here. So you have your nitrogen fixation where they're going to convert it into something that is usable and into like nitrates and nitrites. And then you have denitrifying bacteria that can take soil nitrates and actually convert it back into atmospheric nitrogen. So the bacteria, you have nitrogen fixation, where they will like convert it into a usable form by plants, and then also bacteria that are denitrifying that can put it back into atmospheric oxygen. So the way nitrogen leaves us is when you go to the bathroom. So urea, your urine, is our nitrogen waste. Fish and aquatic animals will use ammonia as their nitrogen waste, and then like birds and reptiles use uric acid as their nitrogen waste as part of the nitrogen cycle. Now, how are we as humans changing this nitrogen cycle, right? So with our croplands, we saw the eutrophication happening. So that was due to excess nitrogen in our environment. As well, another key point is that the nitrogen that we put in our fertilizers actually will react with water, like water vapor, and create nitrous oxide. And that nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas that's 300 times worse than carbon dioxide. So our synthetic nitrogen in our crops is a major contributor to climate change. All right. I think that is the end of my ecosystem ecology lesson. And good job if you are watching this, and I hope that it was helpful for you. And yeah, just good job.